Good morning. My name is Philip Camp, and I teach in the Bible department here. And I get the honor this morning of introducing Elizabeth Duke, who was a Lipscomb student, graduated last year, and now works in the missions department here. Elizabeth, I first had her in class in the spring of 2012, and of all the students that I've had, she was one of them. When you have students, often there are those students that stick out for a variety of reasons, sometimes because they're really smart, and Elizabeth is certainly that, sometimes because they're really funny, and she is that. I don't know if you know her, she can get into these giggle fits where she becomes completely incapacitated, and that's always fun to do to her. But there are others that become memorable, that stick with us because of the compelling stories that they have, because of the things that they teach us and the ways that they bless us. And Elizabeth has certainly been that kind of teacher and blessing to me and to so many others here on this campus. She has a story that involves a great deal of tragedy and pain. We know about pain and suffering, but one of the things sometimes we discover is that when someone we love suffers, it's far more painful to us than anything that we ourselves have or could suffer. And so this happens to Elizabeth in that first semester, that spring of 2012, when I had her in class, and then as it carried on into the following year, she actually had to suffer through having class with me every day of the week for a year in Hebrew. And I marveled as I watched Elizabeth. I mourned with her. I grieved with her as many of us did. My wife and I frequently prayed for her, holding her up before God, because again, it's more than should happen to someone so young. But as I said, students stand out for a variety of reasons, and one is how much they teach us. And so Elizabeth has taught me a lot about what it means to be a child of God, a person of God, one who trusts and loves God. And this morning, she's going to bless you in that way. And so we're going to watch a brief video, and then Elizabeth will come and speak to us.
Mark 5:25 through 34. A large crowd followed and pressed around Jesus, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." I'll never forget the call from my mom at 5:30 that morning, telling me the news about my sister, my best friend, Kristen. I didn't answer the phone at first because it was so early, and I thought it was just an accident. But then she called again and left a voicemail. So I picked up my phone and I listened to it, and the first words out of my mom's mouth was that Kristen had been severely burned in a house fire. And so I didn't listen to the rest of the voicemail. I immediately called my mom back, and she told me that I needed to head to the hospital. So I quickly got up, got ready, emailed all of my professors, and went. And I remember sitting in the waiting room with all of our friends and family, just waiting for the nurse to come in to motion that I could go back and see her. And finally that time came, and I went, and I remember putting on the gloves and the apron to go back in the room. And whenever I got in there, she was hooked up to all the machines just like you see in the movies, and she couldn't talk because she had a breathing tube, but she was fully aware and knew that I was there. And the only thing I could think to do in that moment was to pray with her and Me, a Bible major at the time, didn't even know what to say whenever we did pray. Over the course of those couple of days, I probably went through a whole box of gloves and aprons and things, just going back and visiting with her. And on that Wednesday, she had her first skin graft surgery, and it went really well. We got positive feedback the whole way through while we were sitting there waiting, and then she had her next surgery a couple of days after that. And so I came back to school. I'd already missed so much. I remember sitting here in Starbucks on campus, hanging out with my friends, and then I get a phone call from my other sister that Kristen had actually flatlined during surgery that day. And this was something that none of us expected to happen or were anticipating or worrying, since the first surgery had gone so well. And so I remember rushing to the hospital, and we found out that she had actually flatlined twice, because over the course of those days, the doctors didn't realize the internal damage that had happened. The smoke from the fire had actually caused her lungs to collapse. Our concerns for Kristen went from how her skin graft surgeries were going to look, to how was she going to get oxygen, how long was she going to have to stay in the hospital, and just thinking about how much support she was going to need from her friends and family. So over the course of those next 6 days, her oxygen levels would vary. They would be high, they would be low, and nothing was consistent. And the doctors were very concerned. They asked us if she had any other siblings or family or friends that wanted to spend time with her in her last few days, that they were anticipating her to be with us. And so whenever those words came out of the doctor's mouth, that was when the reality of losing Kristen really hit me. The doctors decided to try one more machine, one they had actually never used before in that unit. And so we were able to go home that night, knowing that she was still going to be with us tomorrow. And I had been there for hours on top of hours, so I decided to go get some rest. And the car ride home was one that I will never forget. Just thinking about the what ifs in losing her. What if she doesn't get to be in my wedding? Or what if I don't get to see her children be born? And the list could go on, and I just started crying to the point where I probably should have pulled over. But then I remembered back to Scripture in the story of the woman reaching out in faith for healing. And I remembered the verse that says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." So in that moment, I had a sense of encouragement and peace and joy that I had not had since the accident happened. I just thought and I prayed that if I have enough faith, that Kristen will be healed. So over the course of those next 2 weeks of just holding on to my faith and staying positive, I hadn't been that encouraged since the accident. I remember just receiving prayers and letters and cards from professors and other students on campus, and I truly thought that if I just had enough faith, if we all just continued to pray, having people praying all over the world for Kristen, that she was going to be healed. And at the end of those 2 weeks, the updates from the doctors just became too much, and I began to lose my faith. During this time, I could list 13 things that were wrong with Kristen. Her heart was failing, her kidneys were failing, her lungs were failing. She had a septic infection, and that's just to name a few of them. And at this moment, I remember just being angry and frustrated at God for the first time in my life. And I was no longer like the woman in the story reaching out in faith for healing. My prayers were no longer faithful and encouraging. They were confusing and angry, and I just remember wanting and begging God for answers for why this was happening. And so I quickly found myself in another story in Scripture, a story of a group of people out on a boat in the middle of a storm. And I wish I could say it was a relaxing, comforting yacht of sorts, but instead it was a small wooden boat being tossed by the waves of doctors back and forth. And I just remember being in the waiting room and just envisioning this story and looking at my friends and family and just all of us wanting some sort of encouragement or a smile even from just each other. And then I remember just in the silence of my own mind just being like, Jesus, why are you letting us drown? Why are you having us go through this? And in that moment, I felt Jesus saying to me, as he did the disciples out in the boat, quiet and be still. And he says, do you still have no faith? Do you have little faith? And so in that moment, I just remember I'd been gripping on to the waiting room chair so much, and my grip began to loosen up, and my anxiety began to drift away as the doctors left the room. And in that moment, I realized that faith in God was never supposed to be easy. It was never meant to be trying to figure out what God is going to do or trying to figure out who God is. Faith is trusting in something but lacking proof for it. Faith is when you come to that fork in the road where you can either choose to rebel against God and resentment for his ways that he's had with you, or you can choose to trust in him and have faith in the hope of who he says he is and that he is in control. I thought that whenever I prayed that prayer of faith, that Kristen would be healed, but I have to go back to what the book of Mark said. Mark doesn't say that our loved ones will never get hurt. Mark doesn't say that our parents won't get a divorce. And Mark doesn't promise that we'll get our dream job after college and live a perfect life. But he does say that Jesus will free us from our sufferings. Rather than being the disciples out in the middle of the sea questioning Jesus of where he is, we get to be the woman reaching out in faith and to remain confident and faithful that Jesus will let us go in peace and to be freed from our sufferings. So I wrote that story that you just watched back in the spring of last year, and a week after I wrote this, Kristen ended up passing away in the hospital. Her 5-week battle ended on April 28th, 2012, and losing Kristen was and still is the hardest thing that I've ever had to go through. She was my best friend. We shared everything. We did everything together. So I'm still trying to figure out how to live without her. And after losing her, I had to go through the grieving process. And I was always used to being the joyful friend, the one who was always able to encourage each other and asking people to hang out and just joyful. But during this time, I was very depressed. I felt alone in a room full of people. I cried pretty consistently. And so I can't express what it feels like to lose someone and that pain that you have unless you've experienced it yourself. And during this time, my biggest prayer was just for hope in something. I knew that I was going to continue to lose people for the rest of my life, and so it was hard for me to cope with that and to accept that. And so to fast forward a few weeks, 9 weeks to be exact, there was one morning when I felt this push to go to Otter Creek Church of Christ. They had sent me encouraging letters and prayer cards when Kristen was in the hospital. And the drive was about 45 minutes away from my house. But I just really felt this push that I needed to go. And so I went that morning, and the whole message was on hope. They had a guest speaker that morning, and I don't remember his name, but I'll never forget the message that he said. And he spoke out of Scripture of Romans chapter 8, which was Kristen's favorite scripture. And I wish I could go more into the sermon that he said, but the main point that I want to get across is that the hope that I experienced that morning was the most hope and joy that I had had in months. And so on the drive home, I remember just driving back and just being so thankful for that message. And I was listening to my Christian music and just almost in tears because I was so happy, and I couldn't wait to get back home to tell my parents. And even in that drive home, I had no idea how much I was going to need that message of hope in just a couple of hours. And so I get home and I go and tell my parents the message that I learned that morning, hoping to share with them a little bit of that joy. And they were excited for me and they were happy for me, but they lacked any emotion in that. Their response was very different than I thought it was going to be. And so in that moment, they told me that we were going to have a family meeting in a few hours, and that my other sisters were going to be coming to the house. And this is something that doesn't happen in my family, so I was a little concerned. But I didn't want that message of hope that I'd heard that morning to drift away. And so I was holding onto it as much as I could. And so 3 o'clock rolls around, and we're all gathered in the living room in silence for a good 5 minutes or so, which seems like a really long time. And my parents were both really upset. They were both crying, and me and my sisters, we didn't know what was happening. And then finally, one of them spoke up and said that my dad had been having an affair for the past year and a half. And there's a lot of different dysfunctional elements that play into that story. But I just want to say that after I heard that, I spiraled into an even deeper depression than I had had before. I distinctly remember that week of grief that I experienced. I just laid in bed and I wanted to die. I was suicidal. I was pleading with God for him to take me to heaven, to just get me out of this sin and this story that I did not want to be a part of. And even 2 weeks after I found out this information, one of my friends passed away in a car wreck. And so these 5 months of tragic things that happened were by far the worst 5 months of my entire life. They were very, very, very hard. Over the course of these 5 months and the fall semester starting up, my mom had even threatened suicide multiple times and attempted those, and it was just really hard trying to be there and to try to help. But coming to school in the fall, it was the last thing that I wanted to do was to worry about papers and about grades and being back on campus. I was very depressed. I don't know if my fellow classmates realize that or not, but sometimes I would run out of class crying because something minor was said about a fire or a hospital or just anything that would trigger that. I wasn't as joyful and outgoing as I would have liked to be. And Christmas break rolled around, this past Christmas break, 2012, and the dorms were closed, so I had to go back home. And my parents were consistently fighting over this Christmas break. And I remember a set of 3 days where I just laid in bed. I'd cried all that I could cry, and I was lifeless. I wanted to help my parents so bad, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what to do, and I definitely didn't have the energy to help them. And so I knew that I was going to be leaving for a conference in a few days called Passion Conference, where about 60,000 young adults were going to come together to learn about God and to worship God. And I thought to myself, if I can just hold on a few more days, then I can get my focus off of myself and my problems and my grief and my suffering. And so we get to the conference, and the first night they reveal the theme of this year's conference to us. And I'd gone a couple of years before, and the main theme was always motivating our generation to care about the world, to care about world hunger and the social injustices that go on. And so I'm sitting there on the first night, and they revealed to us that the theme was that Jesus restores us in the midst of our sufferings. And so over the course of those 4 days, the speakers and the worship just poured into me just hope and truth and the promises that we get to have in Jesus. And one evening, I sat behind this guy. Out of 60,000 people, I sat behind this guy named Corey. And it was evident that he was disabled. He couldn't walk very well. He couldn't talk very well. But I had the privilege of hearing a story while I sat behind him one evening. And Corey was diagnosed with a rare disease when he was younger, a disease that his mom had passed away from when he was just a toddler. And then a few years after his mom passed away, his dad passed away from a heart attack. And then 2 years ago, his twin brother passed away from that same disease. And then Corey knew that he had less than 2 years to live because of the disease that he had. And even knowing this and going through this, he was able to stand there and worship God with everything that he had. And he had more joy than any person that I've ever met. And it was because he wanted to live his life to the fullest, and he wanted to end strong for Jesus, because he knew the promise and the truth and the hope that we have in Jesus. And so Corey's story plays a vital role just in the healing process that I experienced over those 4 days at this conference. You can ask some of my closest friends that ever since I've been back from that conference and just getting to hear the scripture of that, those promises that we get to have in Jesus, I haven't been the same. I can honestly say that I'm more joyful now than I ever have been in my entire life. I think that once you experience true grief and true suffering, then you can truly experience joy and peace and appreciate it so much more. And so I wish I could go more into my story. There's so many different moving parts to it. But some of the main things that God taught me and continues to teach me throughout this process is that I have learned that our hope is in Jesus, not in things of this world. So when searching for hope or peace or love or joy, you have to look at Jesus. You have to look at the source, or else you'll be searching for a really long time. You are never, ever, ever, ever alone, no matter how alone you ever feel. That God is always with you, and that God is not a feeling, and he does not change. And so even in those moments where I felt so alone, God was with me. And I also learned that no matter what happens, God can and will always use it for good. I'm able to stand here today and say that God has used Kristen's death for good. Her legacy of joy for life and her love for people is an inspiration for me and an inspiration for her friends and family, even today. I can say that God has used my dad having an affair for good. He has turned that for his glory. My parents are still together and they're still working through it. But even last year, I heard my dad pray out loud for the first time in my life, and that was just a big thing for me. And also just looking back at Jesus and him dying on a cross and just going through that suffering and that tragedy, that God has even used a terrible death for good, and he will always, always use Jesus' death for good. I've also learned that grief and suffering has taught me things about God that joy and peace could have never taught me. No matter what has happened or will happen, I always get to use those experiences as an opportunity to know God even more, to know my Maker even more. And then the last thing that I want to end on is that God did not put me through anything. Throughout the course of the past couple of years, I asked God multiple times, why did you put me through this? Why are you putting us through this? Why did you put her through this? And I can honestly say that God did not put me through anything, but that he carried me through everything. And I wouldn't be able to stand here today and to share part of my story with you if he had not done that. And so I thank you for listening to my story, and I hope that it brought some sort of hope or encouragement to all of you guys. So.
We're going to pray over Elizabeth and her family, and if some of her family's here with her, if they would come up and join us up here and surround Elizabeth, that would be marvelous.